This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Richard Blackaby to help take our leadership to the next level.
Good morning, Sam.
It's good to see you again.
Yes, post-Thanksgiving and so on. We're already well past and beyond. And
yeah, well, hopefully you've, lost back whatever weight was potentially gained over the holidays.
That might take a little while. I need a few more runs, I think.
Yeah, and we're coming into the Christmas stretch. This whole,
it's a tough
Thanksgiving
season.
to New Year's, that's brutal on the old,
especially when you like to eat.
Yeah, on the old caloric intake. But yeah. So, anyways, today we want to look at just an issue I think that many leaders will inevitably face. And that's wake-up calls.
Yeah.
And so why don't you explain to us what a wake-up call is, and then maybe share some of those wake-up calls. Some are more severe than others,
yeah.
and hopefully you heed the less severe wake-up call.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting one. It just struck me the other day. And part of why I've thought about this, I guess, is following along with my mother's health recently.
Yeah.
I think I've shared some of this before, but my mom had her annual physical several months ago, and you get lab work and so on done. And my mom's a fairly curious person, and so she's later talking with a nurse and just saying, well, how'd my lab work turn out? Am I good? And of course, my mother's in her 80s, and she wants to make sure everything's fine. And so the nurse is kind of scrolling down her lab work, and she gets to a certain point, and she says, well, yeah, it looks pretty good. It's, that looks good. That looks good. Your cholesterol looks good. And then she says, well, I see you had some blood in your urine. And my mom's like, well, should I be concerned about that? Blood in my urine? And the nurse looks a little more and says, well, not necessarily. She said, well, I see here that you've had blood in your urine the last 2 lab tests before this one, so this is your 3rd time to have it. And they just kind of move on. And so my mom later we're talking to me, and she's telling me about her lab work, and she tells me about that conversation. And that was a wake-up call to me. That concerned me. I said, Mom, blood anywhere is usually not good, but to get it 3 times in a row, 3 tests in a row, I can't believe that they haven't sent you to some kind of specialist to check out why that blood's getting there. I said, I want you to tell your doctor that you want a referral. You want to go to a specialist and get that checked out. So the doctor kind of says, well, we think it's probably some kind of infection, but at your age, it's kind of common, but we'll send you to a specialist. And when the specialist first looks at things, they said, there's a little thickening there, but it's probably just this or that. We'll just do a little procedure here, and everything should be fine. And then all of a sudden, when they go in to do this little procedure, the doctor comes back and says, well, I saw some stuff in there that I didn't like. In fact, it looked cancerous to me. And at that point, of course, the C word has come up. And so they said, we've done a biopsy, and come back in a week, and we'll tell you what we found. And so at that point, I said, okay, I'm going with you on that one, Mom. I want to be in the room when the doctor tells you whatever they found. And when we go back there, the doctor says, well, it is cancer, and there's 2 kinds of cancer. It could be a mild form and an aggressive type, and you've got the aggressive type. In fact, she said you have 3 clusters of aggressive tumors, not just 3 tumors, 3 clusters. And so all of a sudden, this is life and death. Now the doctor is feeling urgent and said, I don't do this kind of surgery, but you need to have all of this removed along with your kidney as soon as possible. And so 3 weeks from that conversation, my mom's under the knife, getting all that removed, really trying to save her life from a lethal disease. But the problem, and what of course was frustrating for me, was that the wake-up call should have been blood in her urine. And that should have been the first test should have probably been enough to kind of at least treat it, see if you can get the blood to go away, but or otherwise start exploring and finding out what the causes are. And of course, that's a real life, just recent example in our personal life. But what I find that as a leader and just as a person living my life, there are certain wake-up calls that happen, certain things people say, certain events that take place that ought to get my attention. That the moment that happens, I need to stop in my tracks and say, wait a minute, that's not right. That's something is wrong here. It may not be serious, but it's enough that it ought to get my attention. Mm-hmm. And of course, cancer, one of the big issues that mortal human beings face, which can be so lethal. But there are many issues that in life that can strike us that typically, like cancer, they don't go away if you ignore them. In fact, they typically only get worse. And the longer that you neglect certain issues, certain warning signs, certain wake-up calls, then they become more and more difficult to remedy later on. And so, wake-up calls, there's countless numbers of and kinds of wake-up calls, both personally and then in your organization. I think I've told the story before of a friend of mine whose wife ended up committing adultery. And as I talked with him, he told me that about 2 or 3 years earlier, his wife had said, I think we need to go to a marriage counselor. And he blew it off. He said, that costs a lot of money. I don't know that I want to spend that much money per hour to meet with a counselor.
Yeah.
And now he's going to pay a lot more in dividing all of his assets between him and his wife as they're divorcing. And you look back and say, you know what, that should have been a wake-up call.
Yeah.
When his wife says, things aren't good between us, we need help, we need intervention. But not, I guess, surprisingly for a lot of us, even things as blatant as that, sometimes we'll blow it off and say, well, no marriage is perfect, or maybe we've got a vacation this summer, maybe things will be better then, or whatever, and we don't make an adjustment. I've worked with nonprofits. I've led a number that required donations to pay the bills, like what we need at our ministry. Mm-hmm. But there's sometimes where all of a sudden donations go way down. Or maybe you've had a very faithful donor who's always given generously, and then all of a sudden you realize that for the last year or two they haven't given anything, or just a real token amount. Or maybe as in a church you have a faithful giver that has supported the budget of the church, and all of a sudden they're not giving like they used to. And of course the Bible says where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. And it just appears. Now you could say, oh, maybe they've got things going on, but if where they give their money represents where their heart is, that may also mean when they stop giving that their heart's not with you anymore. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's somewhere else. If you're running a company, a business, and sales go down, you can blame the economy. You can say this is a tough quarter, but that ought to be a wake-up call. Anytime sales go down, or you stop, maybe you haven't produced a new product or a new service for a while. You're just kind of rolling out the same stuff year in and year out, but now sales are declining. There's new competitors out there. There's better products out there, and you haven't kept up. And that's why in business you're always watching sales, revenue. You can't let those plummet for too long before you're in trouble. And so how quickly that becomes a wake-up call for you is very important. If you're a church, but you realize, you know what, we haven't had any new converts for a while. We haven't reached one person in our surrounding community for 2 years. Or maybe you're a church or you're a nonprofit, and you're not getting the volunteers you used to get. You used to have tons of people volunteering and serving and helping, and now you can't seem to get people to sign up and help. Again, that's a wake-up call, because people tend to volunteer where their heart is, and that can be a sign of many things. Maybe you haven't taken good care of your volunteers. Maybe you haven't thanked them the way you should have.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something more fulfilling, more rewarding, more dynamic taking place right now that they're volunteering for now instead of with you. If you see an increase in conflict in your staff, that's a wake-up call for me. If we used to get a lot done and everybody got along well and we had unity, but it seems recently there's been a lot of conflict, a lot of arguing, hurt feelings. That ought to be a wake-up call as well to say something has pervaded the people on our team. There's something going on that wasn't there before. And I can blow it off and just say we're all under a lot of stress right now, or maybe I need to look into this a bit. Of course, certainly a drop in attendance. And I've been a part of things like this before, where maybe you had an annual event, and for a number of years that annual event always had a good turnout. People always signed up and came, and but then you kind of notice the last couple of times we've done this, attendance is really diminished. There's a lot less people coming than used to. Now, of course, that ought to be a wake-up call to say maybe people are kind of getting tired of the same product being pulled out every time, same program. Maybe there's just other stuff out there that's better now. It's done more professionally. Maybe we've taken people for granted and just haven't really been providing good customer service, and now they've moved on. Lots of different examples where if you're paying attention, it ought to be a wake-up call. But the problem is a lot of leaders have things like this happen, and they're busy. They're just thinking about the next thing they need to do, and it's like, well, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that sometime. And the next thing you know, you've got a surgeon telling you we've got to go in right away. You've got aggressive cancer that may have spread, and it's like, wow. I mean, I was kind of wondering about that, but I should have gotten into that a lot sooner. That should have been a wake-up call that mobilized me to action, and instead I kind of blew it off, and now the problem is much worse than it really should have been.
Yeah, well, it's what we do with those wake-up calls that can determine our success or failure. And so let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll look at responses to these wake-up calls. Richard and Daniel Blackaby will be at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove on May 17th through 19th, 2021. The title of this event is On the Move, How God Increases Your Spiritual Influence. It was originally scheduled to be held this year, but due to COVID-19 has been rescheduled. You can find out more and register at thecove.org. Links will also be in the show notes. So Richard, there's lots in our lives that would constitute a wake-up call or warning sign. And I think it's what we do with those warning signs that ultimately determines our success or failure as a leader. And so we've seen before the break what some of those, just a sample of what those signs might be. And so why don't you share with us, how do you respond to those?
Yeah, well, and of course, obviously it depends on what kind of wake-up call it is, but first one I would just say is when that happens, when something catches your attention as a leader, perhaps a warning sign, slow down, take a closer look, lean in and say, hey, I need to take a look at this. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it was just sort of a one-time kind of deal. Or maybe when I start scratching on the surface, I realize this goes a lot deeper. I remember when my dad, years and years ago, my dad was still a pastor in Canada, and he just did not have the time or attention or interest in mechanical things. I know exactly where I get my lack of mechanical ability from. I was not taught one thing by my dad mechanically, but I remember one day he was doing some marriage counseling with a couple, and the man was actually a very good mechanic. And so Dad is giving them counsel, and they're just kind of wrapping up. And my dad says something about, well, hey, you know a lot about cars. He said, listen, my car has really been kind of acting funny lately. He said, I kind of smell this burning smell, and it seemed like it doesn't have a lot of power. And he starts to describe a number of things going on. that Dad had noticed, and the guy said, that doesn't really sound good. He said, do you mind if I just take a look at it for a second? Oh, sure. My dad said, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
He goes out, comes back a few minutes later and said, well, Henry, I checked your oil. It doesn't even register on the dipstick. There's no, you're like, you can't run your car without oil, Henry. And I think that will solve your problem. But obviously you drive your car without oil, you end up without an engine, and then you've got way, way worse problems.
Yeah.
But for a lot of leaders, they're clunking along in their car and they're seeing smoke coming up from under the hood. And they're like, well, we get to the end of this corridor. We get to year end.
I'll check on that
and
later.
There's just a point where you realize I just can't drive this thing any further until I look under the hood and I start checking some gauges here and doing some tests. So the first thing is, don't get in such a hurry that you don't feel like you can ever slow down and take a look.
Well, and that reminds me of the episode we did on just developing margin in your schedule. And if you don't have that, then what are you going to do with these warning signs? You're just going to bypass them and keep on going because you don't have time. Yeah,
and you've got to always be working in time to be caring for details like that. A second thing is just be aware that, for instance, angry outbursts, conflicts, kind of unusual comments typically don't come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
When you're in a staff meeting and someone just makes this kind of comment under their breath that's quite harsh, you think to yourself, that's not like that person. I've never heard them talk that way before. Or maybe someone shouts in the middle of a staff meeting, gets angry and gets defensive or gets emotional or storms out of the room. You might say, wow, she must be having a really bad day. I've never seen her act that way. But more than likely, what you've just witnessed is just the sort of the pressure cooker coming to a boil. And there's probably a lot more underneath that than what you just saw. You're just seeing the surface response. And so typically, if I see a staff person acting kind of in an unusual way or angry way, negative way, engaging in conflict, I want to isolate that person. I want them in my office talking to me and tell me what's going on, and I want to probe, and I want to ask questions. I want to find out exactly what led to that. And you might well begin by saying, listen, today you seem really upset in the staff meeting, and that doesn't seem like you. I've never seen you that way before. Obviously something's going on. Tell me what that is. I'm concerned about you. And probe and ask questions, and don't let yourself get just sort of brushed off like, oh, it was nothing, just had a bad day. I've just didn't sleep well last night. Maybe, but you want to, while you've got the opportunity, dig as deep as you can. And also, you may just need to be aware that there's trends developing. Maybe you realize, hey, we used to have this gala event every year. It was our big fundraiser for our organization, and the last two that we've had only maybe 2/3 or half as many people attending as we used to, and we're not taking in nearly as much money. Well, we could just try it a couple more years, or we could realize, hey, there's a trend developing here. We're losing momentum. We're losing enthusiasm. People aren't excited about this anymore. We've got volunteers don't want to help anymore. Okay, we need to quickly turn this trend around. We can't let this trajectory continue in the same direction. So let's really intervene here. Let's infuse this program, this event with some new energy, some fresh ideas. Let's maybe tear it apart from the ground up down to the foundation and rebuild this thing and make it something fresh and new. But as soon as you start to see a trend in a negative direction, get on it early, because the more that trend gets developed and entrenched, the harder it is to change, to steer it around. So, and another thing I would say is just pray. ask God. And sometimes you, as a leader, I'll just tell you, there's times where you just have this sense. You can just feel something's not quite right in the air. The culture, if you're paying attention, if you know your people well, you can just sometimes just tell. Boy, that meeting, we normally get along great. We're colleagues, but we're also friends, and that meeting was unusually tense. There's something in the air. There's an underlying cause that I don't like, and so I would just say, be looking for underlying causes. Don't ever. We've talked about this before, but don't just address symptoms. Get to causes, and so when something catches your attention, when there's kind of a wake-up call of some kind, that's when you start digging deep and you start saying, what underlying cause would have caused that person to have such an angry outburst? I've never seen them act that way, or we've never had conflict like that in our staff before. Something deeper is going on, and I'm not going to be content until I figure out what it is. And that involves sometimes analyzing systems and analyzing how you conduct meetings, analyzing your products. What are we producing right now? Maybe it's inferior. Maybe our competitors have a better product. Maybe the way we're communicating right now with our staff is causing people to lack trust or feel like they're being left out, or they're being talked down to. Maybe our systems aren't as good as they could be. Maybe we could be more efficient. Maybe we could do things better in a way that encourages our staff more. Just don't assume. What happens is, certainly when things are going well, we tend to not tinker so much. We just leave things the way they are.
Yeah.
If it's not broke, don't fix it.
If it's something that's it needs immediate addressing. If it's that was a thing, but I think we can keep going without really taking a look at it.
And I remember one time when I was running a seminary, and a couple professors just acted a bit unbecoming, and I mentioned it to the academic dean at the time, and he acknowledged that was not right, but he said, well, but we've been just under a lot of stress lately. We had some big deadlines as a faculty, and they were feeling the stress of that. And I said, well, I understand that. I understand where the stress is coming from. But I'm afraid that if we start to feel like we can justify unchristlike behavior every time we're under stress, other stresses are going to come. And we may, if we excuse one thing, then we'll have to excuse other things. And I think maybe we better just address this, to say, hey, somewhere along our system here, we've got some faulty reasoning which says, if normally we act like Christians, but if we're under stress, we don't have to. And I would say, if somehow that misunderstanding has crept into this team, we've got to root that out and just make it clear that that's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And when I see issues happening, when I have a wake-up call of some kind, it's really good to sit down and debrief. It's really good to talk to people. I've had pastors say, well, we've lost a number of people lately. People that used to come that aren't coming anymore. People who used to attend this event, or this Bible study, this prayer time, they're not coming anymore. And a lot of times I'll say, well, do you know why they're not coming? No, I don't. They just stopped coming. I'd say, well, it's probably important to find out why. I tell you what, exit interviews are great. Even if you're a pastor and someone leaves your church, follow up with them. And it might be awkward. Say, listen, I'm not calling to necessarily try to get you to come back. I just want to know what prompted you to leave, and I need to know this. This will help me, because if our church was not providing for you what you needed, maybe we can't. Maybe we're not the right fit for you, but maybe it was just our negligence. Maybe we just weren't the church that we hoped that we would be, and so we need to know what didn't meet your need. Now, sometimes it's their issue, and it could be a spiritual matter for them.
Mm-hmm.
Or they might say, well, you just have nothing for my kids, and it's just too hard for me to come and do church when I've got a 1-year-old I have to hold in my arms, and this church down the street provides good child care, and or maybe you do have child care, but it was just so poorly run. I didn't feel it was safe for my kids. You had way too many kids, not enough helpers, and the people there seemed distracted and unprepared, and so I didn't feel comfortable. And you need to hear those kind of things, and then say, okay, well, we can address that, and sometimes even with donors, people that haven't given for a while, to say, well, hey, can I just ask you, is there a reason? Do you just not financially have the ability right now to give, or have you been giving somewhere else? Could you just tell us, we for our sake, if there's some things we could do better, we want to know what the problem is. And so there's a lot of things you can do. You need to ask a lot of questions. I just tell people, don't assume that you know the reason. You might be surprised sometimes if you ask questions. You don't assume, oh, I know why that person's upset. Well, you might not. You might be really surprised if you ask some questions and discovered what led to that outburst. Another one just kind of related to that is just don't let things fester. That's kind of obvious, but again, problems rarely just go away, and they rarely get easier to deal with later. They tend to always get more complex. They tend to involve more people. People become more angry. And so my rule of thumb as a leader was that once a problem got my attention, better to deal with it now than later. And I'm sure I've told this story before, but when I was a pastor, I had a person one time leave me a letter in my mailbox at the church, and I didn't get it till after the service was over. And sometimes certain envelopes just have a look about them. You know that that doesn't look good. I can tell by looking at it that I'm probably not going to enjoy reading whatever is written inside that letter. And so I waited till I got home and had lunch, and then I opened the letter, and it's a person that's just kind of venting on me as the pastor, and it's, I try to be really open to legitimate criticism, but this guy it was just kind of not, you could just tell he was just struggling, and he's just flailing out at his pastor. But like nothing he says, I mean, there's not one thing he said that is either true. He just felt this way, or he just thought that, but he's not pointing at anything I said or did particularly that was wrong. He just feels this way, feels that way. So I called him that afternoon, and I'll never forget, when he answered the phone, I told him, said, hello, it's your pastor. And there's this pause. And then the first thing he said was, I knew you would call. I knew you would call. And I said, well, of course I called. I've got a church member who apparently is upset, and I want to find out why. I want to make that right. Mm-hmm. And of course he ultimately basically admitted that it was just, he just needed to talk. There wasn't anything I really necessarily needed to change or do differently, but he needed my attention, was the issue. Mm-hmm. And so he got my attention, and we are friends to this day. Still, when I'm friends with him on Facebook, and we still chat and visit. And but he just but I just thought, you know what? But if I ignore that, if I blow that off, if I just say that guy's got the issue, not me, well, then eventually I'll have an issue too, because I'm going to have a church member or a staff person that's upset with me. And maybe just the last one or two things to say: remain positive and remain solution oriented. When you have a wake up call, when something gets your attention, assume you're going to get it worked out. Don't be doom and gloom. Don't become racked with anxiety and concern. And the ship's sinking. We're all going down. We're all going to drown. When you get that wake up call, just start addressing the issue. That's what leaders do. That's not out of the realm of what you should expect. Leaders solve problems, and you've just had a problem brought to your attention. So,
well, the nice thing about wake-up calls is they're not the death nail in the coffin. They're sort of the first sign, and so there is hope if you catch that.
Yeah, and in fact, to me, I'm kind of grateful that I caught it. It's far worse to have some, cancerous kind of disease that has no signs. There's no lump, there's no bleeding, there's nothing, but something is slowly taking over and causing harm, and there's no sign. There's no way to know. I'd always rather get an early warning of something where there's still lots of time to address it. So be grateful for those signs. Be watching for them. And typically, the earlier you get on something, the easier it is to solve. So I would, as a leader, just want to create the kind of culture where people know, hey, as soon as the boss is aware that there's an issue, a warning sign, a wake-up call, full well he's going to just be on that so quick and asking questions and buzzing around and making changes and addressing things, and it's going to be dealt with. And if you create that kind of culture where people know, then probably a lot of those wake-up calls are going to be a lot more civil too. People will just come to your office and tell you. You won't have to wait until there's an angry outburst in a staff meeting to find out. And so once I'm aware of an issue, I want to project a sense of, okay, changes are coming. The boss is aware. He's asking questions. He's on top of it. Things may not change in the next hour, but they're going to change. That he won't let that go.
Yeah.
He's just doing his homework. He's talking to people. He's gathering facts, information. He's looking for solutions. But create that kind of culture where people know, hey, once the leader gets a wake-up call of some kind at whatever level, whether it's serious or minor, he's on it, and he's relentless to stay on it until it's been addressed and it's not an issue anymore. You just make a habit of that, then you're not going to have to deal with a lot of the real big issues, because you will have responded at those early wake-up calls, and it's just a lot easier to deal with those problems at the outset than after they've spread and metastasized for a while throughout the organization.
Yeah, well, wake-up calls, be grateful for them. It's not the end of the world, but it's a warning of what could happen, and hopefully you jump on it soon, solution-oriented, and make the most of it. So until next time.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.